Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. Thank you so much to the Digitize organizers for inviting me to present and to be with you all as best as I can. I'm Danny Spitzberg. I'm a sociologist and a user researcher based in Oakland, California. And I'm going to talk with you about strategic research, standards, and platform audits. I'm going to share some work about the Workers' Algorithm Observatory and try to answer the bigger question of who knows the user. And to start off, I want to share a bit of where I come from in this work and some of my background in thinking. Most of the ways I think about user rights, who knows the user, and how they might be part of designing digital software and tools and platforms comes from a background in worker co-design and in cooperative business. And that's a context where workers are the members and the owners. They have governance and finance and operations rights. And not just data privacy or the protection to not be harmed. Sometimes users and workers in cooperatives will sit on the board of directors or in a workers' council. This is much more common, of course, in Scandinavia and parts of Northern Europe and in parts of Southern Europe and elsewhere around the world, from where I'm coming from. So perhaps this is familiar to you, but that's my background. And today, I'm going to talk about users who are not yet owners or members of a business, but nevertheless exercising control and holding businesses accountable through what my colleague Dan Kalachi calls algorithmic inquiry, looking at the platforms, looking at the algorithms and AI systems, and trying to audit the black box to get transparent understanding of the work, the working conditions, and the effects on the users. Now, to make the most of this talk, I'm going to help you follow along and hopefully come out of it with some of the takeaways right away. So here we are. First, researchers should work for the users and not just work on their behalf or working collaboratively with users in co-design, but literally work with for users, because until users hire us as researchers, we work for the companies, not the users. And so while we still, for the most part, work for companies, another takeaway is that the best research outcome is a new and a better standard. This is more effective than talking about ethics and ethical research because standards are a kind of normative infrastructure I'll explore in the talk that influences collaboration in teams and with coworkers and helps inform market actors and policymakers and much more. And ethics can be embedded within that. And finally, another key takeaway is that independent user-led audits of platforms and AI systems and algorithms can reorient the research profession and the digital economy much more than what you see so far, which are these in-house audits and some conflicts of interest. And I'll share with you cases over the last several years of third-party, user-led, independent audits that have made big improvements to digital platforms and to the policies and laws affecting business and trade and so much more. And that I believe should be invested in and explored further. All right, so now that you have the takeaways up front, let's go into it. Where do researchers work? Let's start by talking about the strategic research, our goals and our approaches to do it. And to figure that out, the question to ask is, where along the production line do researchers work? What's our place in the teams that build the software, in the global economy, shipping new products? Let's talk about some extreme cases to really get a feel for where we work and what that matters. When we work in software, things often go a bit sideways. Sometimes they go entirely off course and run aground, and much more than we'd like. And as researchers, not as the heads of the company, not as the heads of public relations, but as researchers, what do we do in these situations? Well, a popular answer has been, for a number of years, ethics. More ethics, ethical AI, accountable tech, responsible tech, tech for good. You've heard, no doubt, a lot of this rhetoric and a lot of the ways that researchers frame and sell their services. And many of us in research and design, we got into this work indeed, and many other folks amongst our colleagues too, because we want to do ethical work. And we want to serve users. We want to help people through different digital services and products. But while the intention is right and honorable, unfortunately, ethics as a framing for research leads to specific negative outcomes, much more than any positive interventions. And often, like in this case, it's just far too late. I explain and expand on these different outcomes in a paper that you can see in this link, so feel free to nap that. But I'm going to go through them briefly here. A few bad outcomes that emerge from framing research as ethics, or as positioning ourselves doing ethical research, are simply first that, as Manny Moss and colleagues found several years ago, researchers who frame themselves as the ethics person or the ethics owner in a company, not much different than the sustainability officers many years back that were more popular, these researchers end up very visible and very exposed and end up targeted and isolated by leadership and company hierarchy. And the result is that they end up co-opted and recuperated back into serving the existing mission. So this concept of ethics doesn't really manifest and often gets turned back around to serve the existing mission. And last year, Sana Ali and colleagues similarly interviewed dozens of workers in AI teams and found that workers trying to advance ethical alternatives took on huge personal risks with very little reward for what effectively I'll call a second underpaid job on top of their day job to try to help dig the company out of a rolling crisis or a past existing crisis. And third, as AI researcher Meredith Whitaker says, ethics are almost never pegged to any external accountability, something like human rights law or labor law. So when a company talks about ethics, it's almost always an empty apology to maybe do better next time when they've already done something quite harmful. And sometimes discussion of ethics can lead to some low-hanging fruit that certainly doesn't outweigh the harm that we all largely in consensus agree is something to prevent, if not to also bring some good. So while we're working in production and along the production line, it's not so much where we're working as where do we have influence? That's the key question I'll explore for a moment. And this was the goal of research from over the past 2 years in a series of workshops with around 800 different researchers and designers. I'll share some findings from a few of these workshops that were real-life, scenario-based exercises with no right answer. And we asked folks to figure out how to make the best of a messy situation. You can read the full summary and another academic paper linked right down below, but I'll share again a few of the findings. First, researchers were able to influence decisions in these workshops and drawing from their real experience. For example, at the team level, by proposing various metrics for a product they were working on. And here, equity-centered indicators, that was an ethical choice that was embedded within a performance metric for a product, part of a playbook that researchers and designers put together to help shape the collaboration. Similarly, industry researchers and designers have made many attempts, although they're sparse, to influence their peers in the profession and have found ways to communicate both their strategic and their political practices with others who also call themselves researchers and designers in industry at conferences and within their companies. And to the extent that's possible at conferences where they might actually have more of a learning component as opposed to a networking component. So another example here of someone saying, I always bring in meetings some intersection. For example, have you looked at this through the lens of the oppressed? And then third, and most interestingly, some researchers have found sources of influence in software projects at the sector and the industry level, enabling trade. And in this case, from our workshops, one team found themselves in a messy situation and drew from a real life example where they were helping restaurant workers early in the pandemic try to get benefits from the public programs that were running. And early in the pandemic, if you remember, there was very little precedent that we knew of. And so this team decided to bring in a social worker, someone who has specific credentials and training and licensing that comes from an external set of rules and regulations for social work. And they use that to help guide the research for serving and engaging restaurant workers. So altogether, researchers have influence wherever we focus on standards, from the product metrics facilitating collaboration amongst teams, to figuring out ways to protect users as a profession, and at the sector level, broadly to enable trade and commerce and to have rules and regulations that reflect what's the best possible arrangement for that. Just to define that a point further before explaining how it works, a standard, what we mean by that is a normative assertion. We know standards of all kinds, what should be normal for processes and products. For example, a container ship. Containers should stack. Containers should be 40 feet long for the most part. Containers on ships should sail smoothly without blocking a major shipping lane and causing a global backup in the supply chain. Standards are a kind of infrastructure that shapes collaboration and enables trade, as I mentioned, but standards are also something we don't tend to think about. And yet, what's really important and powerful about standards is who does care about them, and that's engineers in particular. Engineers do get stereotyped for ignoring ethics or dismissing it, but they value and follow standards in how they approach their work and how they evaluate it. And in the context of the research profession, we can influence what gets built or not built amongst our colleagues who are in engineering or design or elsewhere by influencing what should be normal for products by helping create better standards. So before showing the importance of standards in the context of audits and how we look at how the engineering has gone into platform algorithms and AI systems, I'm going to summarize briefly some of the research on what makes a better standard and also what it takes to make a standard better. Because as you'll see, these are elusive norms and the infrastructure is relatively intangible at times, but we can engage with it. So how to make better standards, how to make standards better. The first point is simply that standards need to be observable. You can see them in action. Again, 40 feet stacked on a container ship. You see how it works. You see how it enables a reduction in labor force at ports and along the supply chain. Also, a standard needs to be reasonable, such that you can understand the logic and follow it to its conclusion. And then finally, a standard needs to be adaptable, such that it's open to feedback. There's many examples of companies that have released products like the Apple Watch, like VR, virtual reality goggles for firefighters, and for a variety of other product standards that gained from feedback from users, and also in reverse, sometimes rolled back or changed course because the feedback was such that there were existing other products, like a walkie-talkie instead of VR goggles, like a phone clock instead of your watch, such that the standards and inner operations and so on led the companies to change course. So you can take this in mind as we get into some of the work that I'm going to discuss now about the Workers' Algorithm Observatory. The Workers' Algorithm Observatory is a program I helped launch last spring, building on several years of work. We're backed by the Mozilla Foundation, and essentially what we do is we conduct strategic surveys with users and workers. And we're excited about our goals to do these user and worker-led audits, specifically because the software industry and the digital economy is still quite new and still quite different in very important ways compared to what we have for existing institutions and policies to protect users and workers and ourselves as researchers. So, for example, we don't ask organic food companies themselves if their food is organic and if we should believe those claims. We look to third-party audits for labeling, for logo marks. And similarly, we don't ask clothing companies who are running operations for manufacturing in Southeast Asia or the global South if the facilities are safe, if they don't have forced labor or slave labor in the supply chain. Instead, again, like was famously the case with Nike back in the 90s and 2000s, we ask auditors to conduct internal and external reviews of the entire supply chain, the labor conditions, the quality of the materials, everything. And yet, when it comes to the digital economy and platforms, companies like Uber and Volt, the courier company, are doing their own audits and presenting them as transparency reports. Here's the algorithmic transparency report by around 50 employees from the company Wolt. And they're very proud of it. Got great graphics, happy people, some emojis, but without providing access to the algorithms and the explainability specs, how the AI systems work or don't. The real question and the honest question is how accurate or trustworthy are these reports compared to what an independent and third-party audit might provide? Of course, audits are not a solution, and sometimes they're barely even an explanation for how algorithms and AI systems work. But if we know the challenges of audits, we can do strategic research and develop standards to make better audits that can be used to improve digital platforms, AI systems, and all of the technical infrastructure that powers a good amount of the economy. Specifically, the main challenge is that up to now, and especially from the world of ethics research and ethical research, we've heard a large volume of stories and testimonies from people who are struggling to make sense of trying to figure out how much to work on this app for this delivery company, how to label data that's being used for large language models, how to engage in any kind of online, part-time, unprotected work. But we don't have quantitative data or an evidentiary basis for how those costs and benefits work and what we can expect from when things go right or wrong. So in addition to that, not only do we need more quantitative data for better audits, we also need to get beyond what are mostly so far academic interests, where the stories and the theories come from universities, as opposed to a coalition of the companies and third parties that review, potentially, what things are like on the ground. And the last point in particular are, again, workers and users who are very familiar with the impacts of algorithms and AI systems, and who can prioritize what should be the specific items for those audits, what their interests are in getting transparency. Now, workers are already all over the place gathering information to inform their decisions, and academic and policy analysis and regulators can guide and support their research. So this is what I'm going to characterize in a few cases and what we're doing in the Workers' Algorithm Observatory. The first big demonstration project is in Colorado. We're currently collaborating with a group of drivers who are trying to organize a union, and we're helping them collect pay data. It's essentially a survey that drivers share with each other. They sign up, they link their job data through a third-party API, and then we help them calculate the fees that Uber charges them on average, and in what context, and how they change over time. And that allows them to discuss the differences across each other, why some people are getting a higher 34%, for example, of their fares, the ride-hail payments that users and the riders provide, compared to 60% sometimes, or 10%. And this enables them to go to policymakers, which they're already doing, and say, we would like to have more clarity on how to succeed at our jobs. We don't want to ask anything more than that. We just simply want to be able to do driving effectively. And with this audit of these take rates, so-called, drivers are now organizing and gathering more of this data in Colorado, and soon, hopefully, in other cases. Another previous example was in 2021, we helped a group of grocery delivery workers, which were very critical early in the pandemic, to audit and crowdsource the pay data for a platform that coordinated shopping that used to not even have an algorithm, if you can believe it. When this company shipped, rolled out an algorithm, some people got paid more and some people got paid less. We created a text bot. People could send screenshots to us, and this bot would automatically take the data from that screenshot, populate a database. And as you can see in this bottom right, again, some people got paid more and other people's got paid less. That enabled the workers to talk with each other and try to come up with explanations and some mechanisms for why there was some discrimination positively and negatively amongst different groups of them, and to also demand for change with transparency so that they too could figure out how best to do this work. And then finally, a case of labor standards that were already in existence in California. Just before the pandemic in 2020, I was helping drivers in California organize around what were very new reclassification laws in California, such that they were seen as employees with all the rights and protections for minimum wage and overtime and rest breaks and meal breaks and business reimbursements and everything else, which they didn't get as independent contractors, which is their prior legal status. So what they did with a spreadsheet calculator prototype we made was gather a few hundred petitions, wage claims, and they petitioned the state when they went and marched in person to file them, saying, we have a few hundred claims for back pay up to 3 years. We would like you to enforce the law. And then they took that spreadsheet calculator prototype based on the encouragement they got when they delivered these in person and had a couple of news crews show up and said, we're going to make an app. And with our support, they took the process from 2 hours down to 30 minutes with the spreadsheet and then down to 15 minutes with this app that they could share with each other in just a few minutes and file a claim. And finally, over 5,600 drivers across California filed wage claims worth about $1.3 billion, which then triggered a lawsuit by the labor commissioner. And while the lawsuit is still pending, because obviously, as you can imagine, Uber and Lyft disagreed with it, nevertheless, it was a great example of workers demanding some kind of audit, some kind of review, and some kind of transparency for the pay that they were deserved, that they were owed. This is something they initiated and they followed through on, like in those other cases too. So this is my team. Overall, our work is about following what workers want and what users want. We know that who knows the user is the user. They know what they need best. They know what their goals are and what they're trying to do in their work and their life. And what we do is we ask them what decisions they're trying to make, what kinds of data they need, and what kind of analysis they're doing based on that, and where they're struggling to go further. And then based on that, we follow their leadership so they can build an evidence-based case for their organizing, for sometimes engaging with policymakers. And my colleagues at the University of Colorado Boulder, Samantha Dalal, Dan Kalachi at MIT Media Lab, and Andres Monroy Hernandez at Princeton. Together, our work is about building these accountable relationships to support worker leadership and bringing our specialized technical skills. And I know that people at this Digitize conference too have many colleagues and many partners where they are trying to provide highly technical and rather advanced skills too. It's possible to do this in a relationship with folks with less of that skill, but with more clarity on what their needs are, what their goals are, and to enable them to find, for example, transparency into algorithms and AI systems. So to wrap up, if you see political or practical opportunities for these kinds of worker-led audits in the platform economy and the digital economy more broadly, you see opportunities to engage your stakeholders and do collaborative and strategic surveys to get some kinds of data and analysis conducted. We're running more pilots and we're doing more of these collaborations to demonstrate the value and the high threshold of what our research profession can offer. So I encourage you to reach out. My contact info is on this slide, and so is the website. And if you remember Twitter, still there too. Thank you all again for being here, for listening to this talk. And I'm eager to engage with your questions. perhaps asynchronously, reach out to me. Thank you again to the organizers, and I hope you have a great rest of your conference.